Welcome back to the DoctorLady Podcast. I'm so excited to bring you this episode, which is the first of a two-part interview with my friend and real estate lawyer, Sim Jimenez. Sim not only has a brilliant legal mind, but also is someone who understands the importance of empowering people to make informed decisions. In our conversation, we dive into something I've learned the hard way: the importance of not fully relinquishing control to someone just because they seem like the expert. I'll be sharing some personal experiences about being taken advantage of by unscrupulous contractors and what I've learned from those challenges. Sim and I want to help you approach contracts with confidence, prioritize your needs, and avoid the pitfalls of assuming that someone else will always have your best interests in mind. This is a must listen if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the fine print or unsure how to advocate for yourself. So grab a cup of coffee or whatever beverage or snack you prefer and get ready to take notes. You're going to love this conversation.
Do not underestimate how much you know. Especially we as women, I find this to be more the case for women. It's not because they're not very bright women. It's not because they're not very capable or even they're very confident. It's just sometimes the law seems so outside of their area of expertise that people think I couldn't possibly know what somebody else knows who's an expert.
I really love talking to you and love hearing your perspective on things. And you're actually the first person that I want to come interview that kind of encapsulates the approach and the theme of what I want to do through the podcast, and taking into account like everything that we are as women. And that's not homogenous, like it's not like we're all the same, but that's kind of the beauty of it. We all have these different aspects and different roles that we play. And the roles aren't who we are, but yet we have to balance all of these things. And I'm so lucky in the work that I do every day that I get to meet interesting, thoughtful, generous, intelligent people like you who inspire me, who have these stories and these perspectives that I get to the end of my day and I'm like, wow, I feel like I'm so inspired to do something new. I'm so inspired to start this project that I wanted to do. And so that's the approach I wanted to take, is to have a podcast where I can share some of the people that I get to cross paths with. And I think that brings inspiration to other people as well. And so I'm glad that you came to talk with me, because I always love talking to you. We have so many fun things to talk about. I've known you for a number of years now.
Yes.
But I don't know if I really recounted to you kind of the behind the scenes of how we got to know each other better. And it happened to be that we had already had a scheduled appointment to meet each other. And I had a meeting directly before that.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, with the contractor that did us dirty with our building.
Yes.
And
Agreed.
It happened right before. And it came out of nowhere. I already knew he had gone 9 months over schedule, but he came and informed me that he had gone way over budget, like half again as much over budget, no change order signed, and just told me.
Yeah.
And that meeting ended and our meeting was scheduled to begin. So I walked into the room trying to like kind of get my head together.
Yeah.
And I was a little shell-shocked, and I just said, I just had this horrible, crazy meeting.
It's so funny. I don't even remember it that way, but it's so interesting because now I'm remembering the meeting. Yeah.
And you listened to me and you said, you know, that's kind of what I do, right? And I was like, wait, what? And I said, because I knew you were a lawyer.
Yeah.
I did not know what your specialty was. And our meeting was supposed to be for an entirely different thing.
Yes.
And you just took a moment and you listened to me and you said, if it's okay with you, do you mind if I just look over your contract? Can I just see the perspective. And it was just so meaningful to me because there was no need for you to do that. It was so generous of you. And through that, we got to know each other better. You gave me valuable advice. You set me on a great path to find attorneys to represent me. It wasn't the outcome we wanted. I was definitely bullied in that situation.
You were.
But that's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today is because like it was so horrible. The whole experience has been so terrible going through. And with this being an area of your expertise, I wanted to talk to you and find out a little bit more of what are some kind of common blind spots that people have and what can we do to protect ourselves better? And there'll be some nitty gritty kind of questions that I'll ask you.
Okay.
But just like there's specialties in my field in medicine,
sure.
There's specialties in the legal world. And so tell me a little bit about your specialty and about how that is.
So it's kind of funny because of all the things I would use to identify myself as, oh, I do this or I do that, or this is who I am. I'm probably the antithesis of the average lawyer in that, like, that's the last thing that people usually know about me. I just had a walk date with a friend of mine, and she was like, wait, you went to business school? And I was like, I felt actually really good, as twisted as that may sound, that like she had no idea.
Yeah.
So, my professional work is an interesting, we could go into 15 offshoots.
Yeah.
But your specific question was, how did I get here? Like, is that
I wanted to know, first of all, like, tell me about your legal specialty.
Okay.
And then, like, how did you get to that legal specialty? And I'm definitely going to ask about some of the surrounding supportive kind of roles. Yeah.
Okay. So my specific specialty is I'm a transactional commercial real estate attorney. And what that essentially means is that in the law, there's criminal and civil, sure, which I think everybody kind of knows. If it's not criminal, that's everything else, right? So that's civil. So when you're a young attorney trying to decide what you're going to practice, there's first that. And I was very clear that I my whole career, I think the short answer is my process of elimination of how many possible things can I still do while having to eliminate things that I'm clear I don't want to do, which may or may not be, a common approach to things. But so I knew that I definitely didn't have the stomach, although very much had deep reverence for criminal work. So that moved me to civil. And then in civil, there's two sides. There's litigation and transactional work. So litigation is, as you are unfortunately all too familiar with, when things are falling apart. And at least that's the oversimplified version, right? And then on the other side, the transactional are deals coming together. And I think that probably the decision to be a transactional attorney is a really good reflection of my general sort of bigger picture of how I wanted to show up in the world. And that I was more interested in putting deals together. And like the philosophical energy behind that felt a lot better than dealing with pulling things apart. Or things falling apart, right? And so I could go into a really long, probably somewhat boring story of how I ended up specifically, but I always sort of knew that transactional work was where it was at. And then the real estate part is probably not all that sexy of an answer, in that I grew up in a family that did a lot of commercial work, and then they started to develop some properties, and I watched and I was like, I could do that. And honestly, like that, it was that simple. It just seemed like, okay, real estate seems like something that makes sense to me. It's logical. I had this very sort of logical brain, which I think leads one to something like practicing law. And then that's sort of how I ended up in, okay, I'm going to do that. But then even then I always kind of knew, and I think this is probably not in direct help to your, the context of your question. I always knew that I wasn't going to do things in a traditional route. And it wasn't because the traditional route was wrong. It was simply that it didn't resonate. So from that standpoint, I knew I wanted to do commercial real estate. it seemed like a good way to have something to do while also figuring out who I really was. So that's kind of how I got to the practice.
Yeah, and I love something that you were saying I hadn't ever thought before. I truly had never thought of the legal world as being creative. And
I can understand why you would think that.
But in the transactional sense, I mean, of being able to build something, to create something, to be creative in your approach and how you put something together.
Yeah.
It seems like maybe there is some creative aspects that you can be in that still logic form you have to work within the context of something, but there is a creative element, it sounds like.
I think there can be. It's sort of like, I was talking to an architect, which I randomly met recently, and they were like, well, I always thought architecture was so interesting. And I was like, oh, you're building all these different things. And they were like, well, yes. And most of architecture is not like that, just so you're aware. It's much more about trying to survive. And there's these sort of pre-built plans, and people are just wanting you to kind of fit into the required do this part. And so I think the same can be said for practicing law, but that's not to say that that's the majority or that's the only way to do it. I think if I've learned anything, which is probably on a grander life scale rather than the practice of law, anything is what you make of it. And that said, on the transactional side of law, you are putting together deals. Sometimes in the context of what I do, we're buying property, we're selling property, or we're dealing with leasing property, redeveloping something that zoned one way now is changing use. That affects community, that affects the energy of the space. And this is not stuff that I talk about in my legal world, but I think it affects the energy of the earth.
Yeah.
So it's a tangible thing that felt like, okay, I can touch this bigger life force through this very logical, practical, okay, I can make a living doing this.
Right. Oh, I love that, because you can really infuse yourself, your person, into anything that you do.
I'm just tickled because you use the word infused. So one of my other interests is herbalism.
Yeah.
And so an infusion is taking the energy of a plant and applying usually heat in the form of water and letting the energy come out. So arguably, I think in my own humble little way, am trying to find in my little niche, how do I infuse my sort of unique, non-linear legal world with this balanced, yin-yang, earth-focused, perspective. And at the end of the day, we're talking about actually practicing law. We're talking about, in the context of what happened in your circumstance before the litigation, it's about building, it's about creating. It was about building a place that, has so much heart and energy for you. So that part is interesting to me.
It is. I mean, it's so beautiful because it really can be like, if you're grounded in who you are, no matter what it is that you're doing, you are changing the energy of the space that's around you.
I love that. Yeah.
And I mean, I can tell you, after not going through legal issues at all before the last number of years, ever, it has been just a terrible feeling, a terrible experience, all in all. And having people who are knowledgeable and also can help in that humanity of it, in a place, in a surrounding that it isn't fair, it isn't right. And I don't feel like, and I could go to this at some point, I don't feel like often our justice system is just. And
that's a big topic. Yes.
Yeah. And so I feel that putting the humanity into, of course, everything that we do, but something like this is so important. And the attorneys I had definitely had that aspect where like, this isn't fair, this isn't right, and just even hearing that, meant the world. It was like very stabilizing through this very unstable process.
Yeah.
So when I was thinking about wanting to talk to you about this, it's really in also the spirit of wanting to hope that the negative things that I went through, if there's anyone who can who goes through any projects or anything in the future, that they can somehow avoid. And you know,
yes,
hindsight is 2020,
always,
as they say.
Always.
So there's always going to be things that come up that you're like didn't anticipate and expect.
Yeah.
But as we've discussed before, it's really the work that you do ahead of time that really helps protect you. In your experience, what are some of the things, if people are going into either real estate or renovation or things that are involving these contracts, what are some common blind spots or mistakes, errors, things that are preventable that you think if people had a greater awareness or greater attention to, some things may be avoided?
So I think that's a really good question. I can go a number of different ways, but the one that sort of strikes me first and foremost is, and I, because of what I do, as I'm sure is true for you as well, I get all kinds of random friends of friends, relatives of somebody who is just like, hey, I have this random one-off question. And what I think is one of the most important things is when we underestimate our own intelligence, which maybe sounds counterintuitive, but nobody knows you better than you. And something like the practice of law and legal contracts can seem so daunting to someone. And I have had many people, usually not clients, because I work in-house, so my client is my employer, and that's kind of always been my story. But it's usually in the context of trying to be of service to somebody who's just having a circumstance that's showing up, and they're, sort of like a deer caught in headlights of like, oh my gosh, this is happening. I'm either at the beginning or at the end of it or somewhere in the middle, and it's really overwhelming for whatever the reason. And I think one of the things that I notice is there's this sense of giving away your own power, and probably not consciously, but there's this, I'm sure it happens in the medical industry as well, where it's like, well, you're the doctor, I don't know anything about this. And I personally, my experience of that is that there is no one, if you're building something, if you're buying something, if you're a tenant, if you want to be an owner of a multi-complex, if you're buying your own home, if you're buying a rental property, if you want to lease, if you want to do agriculture, it really doesn't matter what it is. Even if you think you're at the beginning of it, even if I've had people say, I think I want to be a farmer, or I think I want to have a B&B, so I'm going to do this, but I don't know anything yet. You know a lot more than anyone else about you. You know what your intention is. And so I think a lot of times I have seen people say, well, I have asked, well, have you read your contract? And the first, oh, no, the lawyer did that. And it's not to say that lawyers cannot be very useful, but you are the driver of your ship. And do not underestimate how much you know. Especially we as women, I find this to be more the case for women. I have had more men approach me just asking for my opinion because I'm a friend of a friend or whatever the story is. And they're like, but that doesn't really make sense, right? Because I want to do this. I don't get the same kind of questions from women because there's this deference. And it's not because they're not very bright women. It's not because they're not very capable or even they're very confident. It's just sometimes the law seems so outside of their area of expertise that people think I couldn't possibly know what somebody else knows who's an expert. So I would say if you come to the table, whether you're at the beginning of signing a lease or purchasing a property, you truly do know the most amount of information about what you need. And do, under no circumstances, no matter how much you like the attorney or dislike the attorney, give away your power in terms of your knowledge of what matters to you. You know what matters to you. You know, what's your biggest fear? Attorneys can have, if like in my instance, what I'm doing is I'm buying, I'm selling, I'm leasing. Those are usually the kind of big categories. That doesn't mean I always know what the client wants. Even if I have the same client repeat over and over, I always ask, what do we care about here? What matters to you? If it's an acquisition, for example, did you walk the property? What do you see that's a problem? It might be the neighbor's dog. It might be a hill that looks like it's going to fall over. I don't have that expertise. And so it may be, it's not always a confidence thing, but it's just an understanding for people that you as the person who is looking for the service knows the most about what you need and want than anyone else.
Yeah.
And so I would say that's the single most important thing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I have a couple questions from what you said that I think are really interesting to put a point on. So the gender difference, I think is really interesting to explore. Do you think that it has anything to do with like the trust difference, or is it a confidence? And I don't know that we know the answer, but just kind of what your thoughts are. Just wondering that are women more trusting that somebody that if they have a good feel about another person, they're like, well, I trust that your intentions are good or whatever.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's a personality and it's not a gender thing. Or is it a confidence level? Or maybe combination. I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether you think there's some gender differences in how we're traditionally brought up.
What a loaded question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely there are differences in how we all approach it. Obviously, I think it's challenging to say there's these generalizations that men do this and women do this. But that being said, like the thing that really kind of struck me in the first part of your question was some people, your question alluded to, if we really trust somebody, will we just kind of defer to them versus some people who just really kind of are more engaged. And I have found with regard to who trusts who, I don't, at least in my limited experience, I don't necessarily see that as a gender difference in terms of how men and women approach something. But I do see that in terms of, and again, this is probably me being the unusual lawyer and answering this question this way. How grounded are we in ourselves? And I'll give an example. So for example, my husband is a very trusting individual. He's a very grounded person. If he has a good feeling, he will trust them. If he has a bad feeling, he will not. And it's a very clear thing for him. I think a lot more women, because of our life circumstances, are trained to tune to our intuition. And when we are determining if something is safe or not, I mean, we as women are doing that all the time. Like, for example, I had a conversation with my husband. I still remember this, like from a few years ago, where there was a quote that said, "This is how many times a day I'm afraid." And I said that to my husband, and it was like this whole, like, women are afraid in the parking lot, they're afraid here, or they're on guard, their antenna is up, right? That's just sometimes a safety thing. And I said that to him, and he looked at me sort of dumbfounded, and he was like, I said, "How many times in the day are you afraid?" And he was like, "That's not a thing." That's like, I don't have that. And so that's just one sort of avenue. But the idea to your question is, I think when we rely on our intuition, we tend to be a little bit more fluid in deferring to that expertise, right?
Yeah.
Versus my experience is if we're really heady, meaning we're really analytical and we're using our mind as our greatest muscle, as our guiding force in terms of what we're directing, which in my experience, I will say I see that more in men than women. On the intuition side, I think it just depends on the person. But on the mind side, the law itself is very analytical, right? It's heady and it's driven that way. And so even if someone is not ordinarily that way, when they are meeting with an attorney who behaves that way, who talks that way, who acts that way, it sort of brings that out in them. And so we're so tempted to take this to a grander scale in life to kind of it's the analytical left brain process that is valued more often than the intuitive wisdom. Does that mean it's a better guide? I mean, you tell me. I have serious doubts that it is, right? But I think that's the best way I can answer that question.
Yeah. No, I think like there's value in each of them. I just wonder about that. Thinking about how kind of I think I was very much more trusting than I should have been. And I think when I read through the contract, I thought, well, when I had I'll get to it. I had a lawyer look at it, and I want to ask some questions about that. But you know, and I thought, well, I'm not really sure what these terms mean, but okay, you know, and like, but I've had my lawyer look at it, but I've heard this is a standard contract. So I think one point I'm taking from what you're saying is you stop right there. If it's something that you don't understand, say, well, what does this mean?
Yes, that's exactly what I do when I'm reading a contract.
Yeah.
Is you don't just gloss over it because it kind of seems to make sense, but you don't really understand it.
Right.
Put a big star there. Ask your attorney or ask, what does this mean? What are the implications of this? And I really kind of hate to say this because I'm sure in your world you do not tell people to Google things. But at the very least, literally just do a basic search online.
Yeah.
You will get at least like, hey, these are questions. What does this term mean? What does this section mean? Why is this clause in there? Absolutely. But I think you had more to your question.
Yeah. And there was, and I mean, I think the whole head and heart thing, and who, and are we always being balanced with how we approach it? Because we need both. And sometimes we will rely on one or the other.
Right.
I think we'll go to our defaults, you know, in my world, you know, there's so many people who feel they're experts in medicine who have not gone to medical school and residency and their research, which is their Google searches, which, you know, I'm not opposed to as a pediatrician. You know, I can say, I always tell them, like, if you Google this rash, you're going to see the worst possible case of this rash. So don't freak out. But, you know, there can be some help in it.
Same in the law.
Yeah. That's right. Worst ever is what you find online.
Right.
So, but I think because I'm faced with that on a daily basis with a lot of experts, I very much also appreciate and value others' expertise.
Definitely.
Knowing how long I studied and worked and my expertise, that I could not reach that level of expertise in that field.
Right. We all choose something to become experts in. Right.
And so when I'm seeking the counsel of others, I think there might even be something with my kind of my background and training where I'm like, well, I'm going to stay in my lane. And I've hired you and I trust you. And then in comes also how busy I am.
Sure.
And that I am a generally very intuitive kind of guided person in that, do I have good vibes about this person?
Right.
And I tend to put a little bit too much faith in that at times. Like, they seem like a good person.
Yeah.
I think I'm naively optimistic. I tend to see like the good, and we all have a mixture of it all. So that being said, I love what you pointed out is that grounding and understanding, what are my defaults? What do I go to?
Yeah.
When I'm feeling busy and strung out, I know that I'm like, just take care of it. Let me do this.
Right.
And that's a
understandable
big error.
To some degree. But yeah, I think when we I understand giving deference to expertise. And I also do that. So for example, when we talked, I said, look, I'm on the transactional side of things. I hire someone when we're on the litigation side of things. So to some degree, yes, we want the people that we're retaining as experts to be experts. And I would go one step further and say, we also want them to react and respond in the way that we would. And I myself, hiring outside counsel all the time, find myself so frustrated when someone is not as responsive. Or, for example, I recently had an attorney that I retained in a jurisdiction that I'm not licensed in. And I still found myself drafting the entire agreement and saying, okay, but do this. And okay, but take this out. And it's like, what are you actually doing other than billing us? And so I understand the desire to want an expert to be an expert. But it's sort of like in medicine, like some doctors are going to do that really well. And some, frankly, aren't. And, how do you determine? Sometimes I think the best you can possibly do is just get yourself as prepared as possible, which is something that was a big learning lesson in your experience, right? And there are things we can talk about in terms of how do you get prepared. But then when you're in it, you have to find your strengths of, is it your intuition? Is it your heart? And say, is this the right fit? Is this working? I have some concern, and speak up.
Great advice that you gave me, because you pointed me in great direction and advised that I meet with all the recommended listed attorneys. And so it ended up, the person you put me in touch with then put me in touch with several. And then I had a chance to meet with each of them and find people who I felt had a similar, had a good perspective on my situation.
Right.
And it was a really good fit. So I think that piece of advice was really helpful to me. I really think what you pointed out as far as being grounded, knowing your natural tendencies, knowing your go-tos, and also combining that with not giving away your power. So you can still hire an expert.
Yeah.
You recognize that they have their expertise, but it's still you.
You're in the driver's seat.
Yeah. Yes. This is still your issue.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's, sometimes I find myself frustrated, like I was sharing, in terms of like retaining someone and I still feel like I'm doing the work.
Yeah.
But I am in the driver's seat in that circumstance, just as you are, right? And so in terms of like your original question of like, what can people do? I understand, somebody might be listening and think like, well, I'm not in a situation where I need to retain an attorney yet, right? So what do I do? The most obvious, and maybe this is too obvious, in my world, it may be, but I have found more and more when I ask people. For example, I recently met a woman who works at a salon who was frustrated when her lease was up. And I said, well, what does your lease say? And she looked at me blankly and was like, I don't know. But the property manager said this. And so those kind of verbal representations, that kind of communication, that's not what you're bound by. You're bound by your contract. Your contract is the thing that is dated and signed by the two opposing parties. And whether or not you think you're on the same side, you're on opposing sides for a landlord-tenant issue, a buyer-seller issue, the person who's retaining the contractor and the actual contractor. Yeah. Your contract is your controlling document, whether that's a lease, a purchase and sale agreement, a retention document, whatever it is, right? So that has, people will say, well, what does the law say? What does California tell you? Well, that's a loaded question, but something for you to be aware of is you can contract and negotiate anything. And a lot of times people will say, oh, well, this wasn't my thing. And they just said, this is my form, so sign it. Yeah. You don't need to do that. In fact, you shouldn't do that. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit, do I also sometimes do that and find myself guilty? Do I, like, on the privacy, things that show up when you're like, I just want to buy the shoes. I don't know. Like, just click. Yes. Are you giving away rights? Absolutely. Yeah. A contract is an agreement. Yeah. You don't have to agree. And I think when it comes to real estate specifically, a lot of times the people that are asking the questions, if they don't have counsel, if they're not a sophisticated business organization, corporation, LLC, S Corp, whatever it is, they're just somebody who wants to open X business, or they're just somebody who wants to buy Y commercial property, right? Read your agreement. Do not assume that you have to agree to that. In fact, a lot of times there's a clause in a contract that will say the parties acknowledge this agreement has been negotiated by both sides and that one side did not draft it. Why do they put that in there? That if you ever end up in litigation, the way that agreement will be construed in a court of law or by an arbitrator or any legal expert who's making a determination on how to read this contract, you have agreed to say, I am of equal value as the other party in terms of our capabilities to negotiate this agreement. Now, in reality, that doesn't always happen. And then people will ask things like, well, the judge will see that, like, I didn't have a choice, right? But you did.
Yeah.
And like, that's how the law is going to construe that. So read your agreement. If something really doesn't jive with you, push back.
Yeah.
I can't tell you, for example, years ago, my husband was starting a certain business, and he is the artist. He's the creator. He is not a contract reader. I am. And so there was a particular venue that there was a property manager who's like, look, we do music. I also don't do this. This is just the agreement. And he actually called my husband and said, why is your woman being so difficult? And the reason I was being so difficult is because I read the contract and I said, look, there's an insurance provision on here where you need to put our name or his business name as an additional insured. The reason you do that is if something goes bad, there's insurance provision that protects you. They were asking that of us. I knew it was commercially reasonable to also ask that to be mutual.
Yeah.
But that's not always how it's taken. It doesn't mean that I wasn't valid. And it wasn't until I said, look, just so you know, I do this for a living and I'm not being unreasonable. This is standard commercial practice.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, okay, fine. And then they signed it. And so I'm not saying it's comfortable and I'm not saying it's always easy, especially when you're going against somebody who their business day in and day out is doing construction or if you're a tenant and you're dealing with a sophisticated landlord who has multiple buildings or, you know, they've been doing this for years. So you might feel like this is just their form. I'm just supposed to sign it. You're not. You don't have to. And if something doesn't sit right with you, again, back to the first premise, you're the driver. You're the expert. You know what matters. So for example, if you have a restaurant and you know that the grease trap is an issue and you're sick and you're looking for a new place because you keep having this clogging issue and your old lease kind of puts you in a position where you're just not getting the kind of service and it's always on your dime and technically something happened where the landlord's use of the rest of the building caused your grease trap to malfunction or whatever the story is. That's intelligence. That's knowledge that's directly related to your pain point as a business owner. The lawyer doesn't know that. Even if, and you can say, well, this lawyer always deals with restaurants. They still don't know you. They still don't know your circumstance. So I want to go back to something you said earlier, like I showed my contract to somebody and they said it was standard. And that the lawyer in me winces a little bit in that because I think it's very difficult in a contract to imagine every hypothetical issue that can occur. And so I have seen people come to me and say, well, shouldn't the lawyer have known that this was here? For glaring standard issues, yes, of course, that's why they're the expert. For example, in a construction contract, if one side can change the value of the contract, that's a red flag. That's a concern. There should be written consent from the other party, right? To change the value of the actual agreement. Same thing with a purchase agreement. Oh, well, this damage happened here and we're going to remove, hundreds of $1,000s from the purchase price as a buyer. You can't just do that. The seller has to agree, right? So there are standard clauses that somebody who's an expert in a particular field should be able to look at. And it's understandable that you would want to defer to that. That being said, it's sort of a gray area because there's no way for a contract to address every potential hypothetical issue that can come up. And so at best, I think there's this misconception that I see a lot when people are asking me questions of, well, shouldn't all of this have been addressed? And the answer is, honestly, usually it depends. And I know that's a terrible answer in some ways, but it really does depend. For example, if I'm selling a commercial building that is $30 million, I'm going to consider a lot more hypotheticals of what could go wrong. I'm going to advise my client accordingly. I'm going to be willing to spend a tremendous amount of time, money, and research to make sure that contract is as ironclad as I can get it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying if you have a small deal, it doesn't matter.
Right.
What I'm saying is we're always balancing how many potential hypothetical and how damaging are those hypothetical negative situations do we want to consider?
Yeah.
And so when you're the little guy in that this is your first and only interaction with fill in the blank person you're getting into a contract with, and the other side does this day in and day out, they know where their pitfalls are.
Yes.
Their default contract, I assure you, is for their benefit, not yours.
Yeah.
That's just how it works.
Yeah.
And so I would say it's a pretty red flag when someone doesn't want to work with you to negotiate the agreement, because you may come across that and people will come to me and say, well, they said this is just take it or leave it. Then I would say, well, then you're assuming a risk and you need to decide, is it worth assuming that risk?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, that's where I think, I don't know, I would probably think it's a stretch to call it artistry, but that's where the nuances of practicing law aren't as black and white as they're commonly misperceived.